friends, welcome to this module on web security. Fine. In the previous module, we had looked at security in JDK, security in general rather, where we talked about the key pairs, we talked about the hashing, we talked about what is a digital certificate, what is meant by digitally signing a thing. Fine. So, that was more useful for integrity aspect. Fine. All those key elements are useful even for web applications. Fine. So, now we have another thing which is about security for the web applications. Fine. In web applications, especially the Java based web applications, we have got various ways, various mechanisms of securing our components in the web application. Fine. By securing, what is being what we mean here is, we would like to have certain URLs being secured, okay, certain resources. When I say URL, it refers to a resource. So, we have certain resources which have to be protected from use by unauthorized person. They cannot be accessed by unauthorized persons. When I say unauthorized persons, that would mean there has to be some mechanism where a person can be identified, and that is what we call as authentication. So, authentication is nothing but a process by which the client can be identified. Fine. We have an identity for a client. Fine. And of course, there are other things. Okay, a client or a group of clients are authorized. Fine. A group of clients will say, they have a particular role. So, we have a concept of a role also. Fine. So, we can have roles. Fine. We can have we have roles being there, and each and every person should be having a particular role. Fine. So, person is identified to have a particular kind of a role. A person has its authentication. Fine. A person would have to be authenticated. So, when a person is authenticated, his role is also being identified. Now, who does this? Who will manage the role of the person? What is this role of the person? Is it the application? Not necessary. Application has its own set of components, where application developer, he is not supposed to worry about who is authorized and who is not authorized. There are very little places where he may think, okay, this particular component needs to be available only to someone having a role of an administrator. Okay, there might be only such few components, fine, which are role based. Fine. And most of the places, it may be where a particular application is being deployed, fine, rather than someone from the application side determine who is who, how to find out, how to authenticate, the mechanism of authentication, or that authentication mechanism, fine, if we recollect, is also something which can be taken as a responsibility by our containers, fine, the Java EE containers. So, even a web container, every web container would have its own mechanism of authentication. Okay, rather than authentication, about managing the roles and persons, determining who is who, fine, having a valid list of who are the users, and some mechanism of what should be the mechanism for authentication. Fine. For example, the information or authentication related information, very commonly we have something like, we have got the things called username and password. That is a very that is one kind of a mechanism for authenticating and finding out, if this is so and so person or not. So, such things, managing these people, right, managing the users, the managing all the users is something which can be done by container. Fine. This is my user list. So, fine, different servers, different web servers would have their own mechanisms to manage this. For example, in case of Tomcat, there are again various options available. One of those options is where you could say, okay, we can specify all the users who are there in a kind of a file. It is an XML file called tomcat users.xml. So, you could update the tomcat users.xml to contain list of valid roles. Okay. So, you have entries for the roles, and then creating entries for the users, where you will say, okay, this user has this name, and that is his password, and this user has these kind of the roles. A list of roles can be assigned to a user, or this user, he is having all these roles. So, that way a file can be used for, in case of Tomcat, Tomcat is using such a mechanism, fine. Each and every container would have its own mechanism of managing it, fine. Now, authentication, fine, authenticating would then become the responsibility of container, fine. But how to have authentication being carried out, fine. It would be done by container, but how should it be done? What kind of interface should be given, fine. So, we got various kinds of options, and this is the information which would be given in our deployment descriptor, fine. We have for our web application, we got a deployment descriptor, that web.xml file. Within the web.xml file, you could make an entry which says, okay, whenever authentication is required, when it needs that, yes, someone is required, I need to know that who is the current client, fine, and fine. So, in order to determine who the current user is, who the current client is, fine, I would like you to use a particular kind of a authentication mechanism. So, in web.xml, we got entries to find out who that person is, fine. So, we got some entries in web.xml. In the deployment descriptor, for example, we have a entry called login config, fine. So, we can put login config. So, we have a tag called login config which has authorization mechanism. So, it has auth mode, fine, and the auth mode you can say, authentication should be done using, it has to be a form based authentication. Very commonly it would be a form based authentication, which is more common, fine. In case of a form based authentication, fine, the application developer would be able to design his own page for login, fine. He is able to design his own page for login, and he also has to design another page in case the login fails. He needs to have another page. So, these would be created as mostly as JSP files, fine. So, there are some requirements which are there for this JSP file, but the kind of entry which goes in the web.xml is, we have a login config, fine, auth mode, and we will say form, fine. The other auth modes, for example, you can say basic. Now, if you say basic, you do not have to do anything. If you just say basic, just give a realm name, fine. If you are saying basic, it is actually the browser which will pop up a small window asking for login ID and password, username and password. You do not have to design any form or anything, but if you have said auth mode is form, okay, in that case you need to also specify login form config. You have an inner tag called login form config. In the login form config, you mention two entries. One will be an entry login form page, fine, and login form page and login error page. So, we have got login form page to mention, to link to a JSP. For example, you can say slash and you start with a slash here and put your location within the web application where you got your JSP. For example, you can say slash login.jsp, fine, or you, and that is one entry, and you will have the login error page where you could have, for example, you can say slash login error.jsp. So, if there is a login error, fine, the page which has to show with the error message and whatever else, fine, you can determine what it is, fine, you can create your own login error page, and that should be mentioned with the login error page. So, that is a kind of entry which goes if you want a form based authentication, fine. So, that is about, okay, what is the mechanism used for authentication, fine. Once you have decided that this is the method used for authentication, of course, those components, if it is a form based, you will have to create those two components also, those two JSPs basically, fine. So, that is one aspect. So, we have one aspect of having a, what is the method of login authentication, fine. So, authentication, the login, how it is to be done, fine. So, this is one, and then what we have is, okay. So, now we have, okay. So, this is one aspect. Now, another thing is, you would like to protect certain URLs. This URL is the one which requires a particular role. So, we can do all this just by declaration within our web.xml file. It is all declarative, we do not have to write nothing in Java code at all, fine. It is all declarative. So, we can say, okay, I want to have some kind of a security constraint, fine. So, you can put your security constraint requirement on the URLs. So, what we have is a tag called security constraint. Within the security constraint, fine, you could put a tag, there is an inner tag to have a group of URLs, fine. To have a group of URLs, we have web resource collection. We have a web resource collection tag having an inner tag called web resource name and URL pattern. So, a web resource name and URL pattern, that creates a whole set of URLs, right? It is a collection of URLs. So, web resource collection is one such thing. So, one of the things inside our web.xml, fine, within the security constraint is the web resource collection. So, we can have several such web resource collection, fine, but then this is one security constraint. So, in this security constraint, okay, I want a particular role only for this set of, for this particular set of resources, fine. It is one set of resources, another set of resources, a set of resources having a name and a URL pattern, fine, and then I would like that to have a particular kind of a role. One more thing, the roles which you want to have, all that has to be listed, fine. In the web.xml, all the valid roles have to be listed. So, they have to be listed independently, they are not within the security constraint, fine. So, they would be outside the security constraint. In web.xml, you have something called security role, and within security role and / security role, there is an inner tag called role name, and where you just give the role name. So, create such security role entries for every role which is available to you, which is going to be used in your web.xml file. So, we have the role, okay. Now, we are asking that a specific role should be used for this particular set of resources, fine. So, we have a fine. So, we have a tag for specifying that which role is necessary. So, we have this entry which goes in a web.xml to specify that yes, this particular role are required. So, we have auth constraint. Within auth constraint, we will say role name and give the roles, the list of roles. So, you can put a multiple role name entries and say, okay, these are the roles which is required for, which have been authenticated for this particular, which are allowed to use this particular set of resources. Now, if you have your form based authentication, right. So, I said for a form based authentication, you will be creating a JSP page. But there are a few requirements for this JSP page, because the authentication is being done by the container. It is not the application who is doing it. The application developer is simply creating an interface. So, in this interface which the application developer creates, he needs to have a few, he needs to have there are specific requirements of this. You may design whatever way you like, fine, but then it should have a form entry. It would be HTML kind of entry which has a form tag. So, in the form tag, you would have action equal to, there a specific value is there which would be used by container. So, we have j underscore security underscore check. So, action equal to should always be j security check. Again, the input tags, when we put the input tags, input type equal to text, fine, you will have a username. So, that username input type equal to text, the username, for accepting the username, we have the name equal to, that this tag input tag will have name equal to j underscore username, that is one requirement. And then if we have the we also will have a password field. Now, for the password field, you should always keep, okay, the password field normally will say input type equal to password, fine. The name equal to, in this case the name should always be j underscore password. So, these three values, fine, these are specific to any web container, whatever web container you may be having, fine. You always design your JSP with these three things. The action of the form, okay, most of the time you will say method equal to post, fine, to keep it more secure, but the action should have j security check, input for username should be j underscore username, and input for password should be j underscore password, fine. So, once this is done, fine. So, this is one more requirement which you have for the JSPs which you develop for the purpose. So, your login page, fine, login page, fine, login page config, fine. Within that login page config, you have your login page. So, in the login page, the which you have the JSP which you develop should have these things, fine. These are the constraint it should have, fine. And then we have one more thing. Now, continuing further, what we have is we have okay. The next requirement would be, yes, you would have your data, that yes, within this whatever data is there, fine, that data needs to be authenticated. That data many times, yes, you have certain set of URLs for which you would have that, yes, this particular data, whatever the data part which is coming, that content even in transit, if someone catches hold of it, should not be able to make out. I want that to be confidential, fine. You have some HTTPS, fine, you will have to enable the HTTPS things, fine. HTTPS would actually require that key pair what we had talked earlier, fine. A key pair for which a key is managed on there is a key pair for which the public key for your server would be available to the client, and the private key is used here, fine. They have a mechanism for exchange of the data. So, fine, it would use the SSL, fine. So, there would be a SSL which would be used for communication. And so, I have certain set of URLs for which the content has to be transported on a in such a way that it has to be a confidential one, fine. So, for that again, what you have to do, you do not have to do much things in your application. What you need to do is in the web.xml file, you have the you have the security constraint, fine. That same thing, security constraint again has those set of it has the set of resources by saying web resource collection. So, we have the web resource collection having the inner tags to manage a resource collection using the URL pattern, giving a name and URL pattern. So, you have such a thing, but then you do not add you may have auth constraint also, that yes, this is, since it is confidential, maybe it may also require that it must be available to a specific roles only. It may or may not require roles. If it does not require a role, fine, you would not have a auth constraint, but you would have a user data constraint. The user data, the content here, that has a constraint that yes, this needs to have a transportation which would be confidential, fine. So, transport mechanism has to be confidential. So, you have a tag there for specifying that the transport, fine, the transport has to be confidential. So, that can be done here, fine. So, you can put in web XML and specify. So, this, you can see this is all very declarative, and yes, using just the declarations you are able to manage security here, fine. So, this is one aspect. Yes, we have a declarative way of specifying our security, specifying the roles which are available, fine. So, all those things are available, right. And then so this is one aspect, fine. Now, what you have is you have also been able to. So, what are the things we have done? We have been able to specify a set of roles, but before that container has the responsibility of doing all the authentication, fine. Now, container has done the authentication, but it is a servlet here, or it is some servlet here which would like to know who is the current user. So, for that, yes, now we have something in our program, fine, within our servlet, within our any of our Java components, fine. Okay. There is some component and it would like to know whether if it has been authenticated, whether the proper person is there or not, right. The person who has been authenticated, what kind of role he is having, right. Does he have a role of a particular kind or not? So, if you want to determine such thing, we have in the HTTP servlet request, this is all HTTP. So, in HTTP servlet request, we have this method called get is user in role, fine. We have the method called is user in role, where you can specify a role name and get a boolean value, true or false. So, whether the current user, logged in user, has a particular role or not. You may not like to know, you may. So, one is you normally would like to use this role based things, but sometimes you might like to know the name of the user. Oh, who is that remote user? If you are interested in knowing who that remote user is, in the HTTP servlet request, we even have a method called get remote user to give us the name of the user. If no authentication has been carried out, it can return a null, it would return a null value if no authentication was done. So, if it is returning a null value, fine, you could send back, you could send redirect and say okay, fine, I send it back and give a send error and say okay 401, fine. So, fine, you are unauthorized. So, we have those kind of response codes, so that it would force a authentication from the client if he is not been authenticated, fine. So, that is something which you can do from within your servlet or within any of your Java components on the server side, fine. Within your Java component, another thing, okay, we can find out who that remote user is, but I would also like to know how the authentication was carried out. If it is basic authentication, maybe it is not so secure. We have form based authentication, almost similar, but we even can have client certificate being used as authentication, fine. In that auth mode tag, you could have said client certificate. So, has he been authenticated by using client certificate? If he has been authenticated by using a client certificate, or which kind of authentication was used, fine. So, for that HTTP servlet request even has a method called get auth type, which returns a string. So, that string would be saying okay, it is basic, or it is form, it is auth cert, or it is a message digest, fine. Which particular kind of authentication has been carried out, that can always be determined by the application, any Java component on the Java component on our server side. So, server has to do the authentication, and all that information from its servlet request is able to, able to make it available to our Java components, whosoever has the. So, mainly the servlet, or even it could be even a JSP who is trying to use that information, fine. So, this information is available, plus we have that get remote user method, and there is an earlier method also called get principal. That method get principal returns an object of principal. Now, you may wonder what is that principal? This method has been there since the beginning of servlet API. That was the old way of keeping, it has nothing much more than having a name. This get principal returns principal, which is available in java.security package, and the principal has nothing but a method called get name. So, it is just nothing much more than keeping a name only. So, it is almost equivalent of using a get remote user method, fine. So, get remote, fine. These are some of the methods which we have available on our for our programmatic things. So, programmatically if you want to check anything, yes, we have Java components getting all these kind of methods for us, fine. And okay, and so this is one aspect of our web security. So, now one more thing for our web security, what we also need is we need to have transport requirement was, we have transportation which is going to be confidential. If transport has to be confidential, we will have to set up our SSL, fine. In order to set up SSL, yes, we will have to update our on the server. Now, this would again depend on from server to server, fine. So, for Tomcat, yes, there is a server.xml, and you will have to make entries there to say yes, I need SSL. You will have to ensure that SSL is enabled, and it has been enabled for the server side. But one important thing, what you need here is a certificate, fine. You will need a key value pair, a key pair to be generated for our server, fine. And this key pair, fine, the public key of that should be available with the clients. The server would keep the private key, it would have a key store, fine. So, it should be managing a key store. So, you will have to be using here again that tool for, you will have to use the key tool, fine, which is able to manage a key store for us. So, you can manage key store, fine. So, for your application you create your, so for your web application you create a key pair, fine. So, this application uses a particular key pair, fine, and then that could be actually specified, that has to be known to the server, how the server would use it, fine, and server would be able to specify what is that key pair, what is the public key, what is the fine, the server should be able to specify to use a particular alias from that particular key store, fine. And we have the client, fine, the clients who should be able to authenticate. Now, see that key pair many times what see what would be required here is the key pair which you generate, fine, it has to be something which is endorsed, fine, the certificate which you use in your key store. So, your key store should normally have certificates which are available on the, which are signed by authorized agencies, fine, because the public keys only of the, you have those certificates are nothing but public keys. So, you got your certificates available globally, fine, in most of the softwares it is available only for the certifying authorities, fine. When we have a certificate being signed, okay, these certifying authorities have their own self-signed certificate, that is one, but then there is actually a chain of certificates. If something is being signed, a certifying authority has his own sub-certifying authorities. That sub-certifying authority can also be signing, you may be having a certificate which is not signed by the certifying authority directly, but by a sub-certifying authority. So, if there is a sub-certifying authority, the sub-certifying the certificate which you have is having actually a chain of certificates. So, we do not just have a certificate, entry in a key store would have a chain of certificates, fine. We have a certificate chain in the form of, yes, we have a certificate for the certificate which is for example, certificate issued to us by a sub-certifying authority, but that has, so it would have the certificate of that sub-certifying authority which has been signed by the actual certifying authority, and for that certifying authority we have a self-signed certificate. So, we have a root, there is, at the root there will be one self-signed certificate. Now, whosoever is the self-signed certificate, that is at the top, okay, that certificates that certificate must be publicly available to us, and we must have it as a trusted certificate in our key store. If we have a key store where this is available as a trusted certificate, only then it can work. So, you will have a lot of task here to set up a certificate, fine, because many times maybe you do not want to have the cost of having a self-signed having a certificate from a certifying authority, because yes, in order to maintain a certificate there is some annual recurring cost associated with the certificates available issued by those certifying authorities. So, instead of using those, you may be interested in just generating your own key, just generating your own key pair, fine. So, if you are generating your own key pair, key tool can be used, and then in that case you have your own self-signed certificate, but this the public key should then, you will have a task of distributing this self-signed certificate even to all your clients, otherwise they would not be able to, fine, they will have to manage it within their browser. The browsers also manage their key stores, fine. So, this certificate will have to be managed in the browser. So, for that, yes, you will in the key store, in the key tool we have those commands for actually exporting a certificate also. If there is a key entry, you can export a certificate out of your key store, out of any key store by using a key tool command. So, key tool minus export is available, fine, and on the other side, if there is a key store being used by an application, fine, the application can use the key tool minus import, fine, to in order to add import certificate, in order to add a certificate entry into his key store. So, key store management can be done by using that key tool, fine. So, you will need a lot of those things. If you are interested in having a SSL, you will need to do a lot of exercise on that front also, fine. So, fine. So, yes, security on website involves is quite it's quite involved if you are interested in SSL, fine, in security on the transit. But if you are just interested in securing some URLs, things are quite simple. It's simple and can be done by just using our declarations in the web.xml files, fine. We have the web XML file having those, fine, just you are putting the security constraint, fine. You have a login constraint, security constraint, and you need to remember that you will be using a login. We have the security role and mention all the logins which are available. Now, another point is you may have created certain servlets, fine, and these servlets, have been created by someone else and you are just simply trying to use them. Those servlets also use a particular role. Now, when we have servlet using a specific role, okay, for that role, fine, the role which is used there may not be exactly the role which we have here in our current server. So, on server, on our web server, web container, the web container uses a particular set of roles which has been configured, which it has been which has been configured, but we have on our server side, we have our Java component which would like to use certain roles, but they have a different name. They have an equivalent role here, there may be a one-to-one role, fine. So, if there is a one-to-one mapping, someone says this is admin, on the other side, on the servlet or the Java component which you are trying to use, so you have mainly the servlet. So, on a servlet which you are trying to use, if you got the servlet is trying to use a role called manager, whereas here there is a role within your container, the role is understood as admin. So, maybe here it is admin in the container, but that admin is same as manager for our servlet. Now, what do I do? Or do I recompile? I do not have the code for the servlet. I am interested in using that servlet component, but I do not have the code with me, or do I recompile and ask everyone to deploy it again? Fine, I have coded with one, but this application is being deployed in different places. At different places, equivalent of the manager which is used in my servlet. In my servlet, I am doing the check, is user in role, and I am saying manager. Fine, but some places it is admin, someone says administrator, fine, someone may have a different name altogether, fine, but they are all equivalent of what is manager for my servlet. So, now what do I do? How do I use that servlet? I can't have that servlet being compiled, and I don't it would be a big maintenance task to managing a different servlet which has been compiled with different values for that particular role for each different places where I have deployed it. So, rather than that, there has to be some mechanism in my servlet within my container itself. So, within my web.xml. So, within the web.xml, we can, where we make a servlet entry, we can put an entry to let the servlet know that yes, to let the container know that if the servlet is in the servlet API, if the servlet API looks for this particular role, you should understand that actually this is the particular role, fine. So, you will say okay, there is a servlet role which is manager, because that is what my servlet understands, but you have a link role, fine. So, you have a role link, it is linked to admin on this particular deployment, fine. So, you have your application deployed at different places. When it is being deployed, fine, in the servlet is saying okay, I will be using a different I am not using the same, I have the servlet is only using a specific particular role name, and I will in different places in the web XML, I will have to change the admin there will have to configure and say okay, we have that manager which is used by our servlet in this application, but on our deployment here, our container does not understand manager, the equivalent of manager for our container is, and I can give that, fine. So, we have some entries which we can make in our web.xml, fine. Those entries, let me tell you. So, we have these entries which are part of web.xml, and in this web.xml for the servlet entry, within the servlet entry, we have security role ref. There is a entry which is inside the servlet entry, you can say security role ref, and within security role ref you will say role name, the name which is understood by the servlet, and we will say role link. So, this is linked to what is the role the container understands, fine, the role which is for the container, fine, locally for the container, this is going to be my role, fine. So, you can have this kind of a role linking being done, where the role names differ, fine. So, this is something which you can, that is a mechanism to have a servlet, fine. So, you can deploy a web application even in different kinds of mechanism. And see, this is all very declarative, very simplified, fine. It is only when you have to go for a for your requirement of SSL, that is where some more task will have to be done. Otherwise, most of the things are managed just by using declarative security. It is fine, just a declarative things, fine. Okay, fine. So, that is what we have in this module. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.